We shall proceed to the second session of this afternoon, and in that respect, you will see, according to your program, we will have three panelists, two of whom I have heard, and I assume most of you here have in the past, so there's no need for introduction except to say that you will, if you feel as I do, looking forward to a treat. First, Chirs Skrebowski, and the topic, Entering the Foothills of Peak Oil. I call on him without further delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And once again, thanks to the organisers for having me back, which is always flattering. I think one of the key things in all analysis is to try and get yourself out of the way. What I mean by that is there's all sorts of hopes and dreams that we have. There's all sorts of prejudices we have. But that's no good for analysis. You've got to dissociate yourself. You've got to try and find what the numbers are telling you, what the facts, as best you can establish, are doing. So without further ado, we'll simply move on. That's who I am. Many of you know me. I don't dwell on it. I've been around this industry for 38 years, which I suppose bespeaks a certain lack of imagination, but there we go. What I've tried to do here is I've tried to encapsulate in a single diagram really the challenges that the industry faces. Now, one of the features of the industry is it loves mixing up units. It uses billion barrels for reserves. It uses barrels a day for flows. And of course, one of the things I want you to take away is the idea that it is the flows that matter. Our society, the way we organise ourselves, depends on timely flows. What the stock is very much subsidiary. Now, if we take a very quick look, we see that the discovery rate is roughly 9 billion barrels a year at the moment, which would equate to a flow of 25, 26 million barrels a day. Now, that would be fine if the date was 1960, but it's not. The date's 2008, and we're currently using about 86.5 million barrels a day. So we've got a huge mismatch here. We're finding about 1 barrel for every 3 that we're consuming. So that's our first problem. Our next problem is our attempts to get away from oil to date haven't been too happy. We've worked very hard on biofuels collectively. We've already run into the conflict between food and fuel, and yet it's only amounting to a tiny 1.5 million barrels a day into the collective pot, if you like. If we then look at the other great hope of recent years, which has been the Canadian tar sands, I've attempted to draw these reasonably to scale. Canadian tar sands reserves generally quoted about 174 billion barrels, lots and lots of the stuff. But although it may account for half of Canadian production, that's still only 1.4, 1.5 million barrels a day. So we're having real difficulty mobilizing this at anything like a useful rate. And that's intrinsic to the resource itself. That's not a failure of our abilities. If we then look at OPEC, non-OPEC output, we find their reserves are only about the same as those of the Canadian tar sands, but we've got them absolutely at full bore. We've got them producing, this is not readable, it's about 50 million barrels a day. Or if we convert it into billion barrels a year, it's about 18 billion barrels a year. Then if you apply the reserves production ratio, so beloved of BP, you find that's 10 years. Now, in fact, you can't just simply empty oil out on that basis. But what it means is our chances of sustaining this sort of flow from non-OPEC for really very much longer are essentially zero. If we look in contradistinction at OPEC's reserves, they claim 934. You've all heard about how 300 of those are suspect. So we've put those to one side, if you like. But even then, even if we just go to the reserves we're more confident of and look at the rate they're flowing it at, we find that they are in a much more sustainable position, because that 36 million barrels a day is about 10 million barrels, 10 billion barrels per year, which then on the BP thing gives them about 60 years, and that's without the extra that they like to claim. So we have, in essence, the start of an analysis of our problem. We're finding too little, the alternatives aren't really working, we've got what we can control absolutely flat out, we are going to become more and more dependent on OPEC, almost no matter what. I think we'll come back to this, but I'll just briefly illustrate this, that we use about 55% of the production for surface transport. By that I mean diesel and gasoline. There's other transport, that's ships, bunkers and aeroplanes, accounts for about another 25%. Heating in various shapes and forms accounts for about 10%, and then about another 10% is the non-fuel uses, the lubricants, the petrochemicals, the solvents. Now, I've got far too many graphs, so we'll whistle through some of these because they either you've seen them before or they're reasonably self-evident. And just to reiterate, I think the point about peak oil, it's that further expansion becomes impossible. It's not that you're running out of oil. You'll still be finding oil. There'll still be good news stories. It's just you won't be able to have quite as much as would be needed to sustain or expand the flow. So for this reason, it's all going to occur rather more rapidly than we hope, because it's simply like a scales. That all you need is one feather in one pan of a balanced scales and you tip. And we can see this if we look at, this is the EIA's latest projection of flows from various countries over the next 3 years, these 3 years. Now, there's an element of exaggeration in some of these, and numbers have a nasty habit of being revised down when they refer to production more than 1 year out. But if you mentally blank off those 4 largest ones on that side, you would suddenly see that the rest is almost a balanced scale. Now, what this tells us is we're not quite there yet. We're not at the point when it's going to tip, but equally we can see that it is going to tip in the foreseeable future, and maybe not very, very far in for that. This, I think, reiterates the first diagram, so I won't dwell on it. That's just bringing things into context, showing that although we've done well at expanding biofuels and tar sands, they're really a tiny proportion of the whole. Peaks are not of themselves special. We've reached peak in a number of countries around the world, and the rate of fall after the peak is quite rapid. What is, if you like, disturbing to us is, naturally enough, the investment occurred in the countries where it was easiest to operate, where you had the best conditions, financial and other conditions for operating. So as these peak, as these go into decline, in effect you are becoming dependent on countries you'd be less happy to have your money in, less happy to try and operate in, and we're quite clearly seeing this. We've also reached the point where about 28 major producers, that's producing over 500,000 barrels a day, are already in decline, and they're accounting for over 1/3 of global production. And of course, once you get to 51%, this is this scales analogy, then you've reached peak oil. We're starting to see serious concerns mentioned by the oil company CEOs themselves. Christopher de Margerie here is talking about the idea of replacing reserves costing $80 a barrel. Well, the current price of oil is $70 a barrel. There won't be a single oil company going ahead with any new project at the moment. All sorts of projects are going to be postponed, delayed, maybe even outright cancelled, because you cannot take the financial risk. The oil prices are going to revive quickly enough to justify your project. So anticipate that future production capacity is actually going to fall away. This is going to be the impact of the current and upcoming recession. Oil prices will fall. We'll feel a bit more cheerful about that, but it will be very destructive of future capacity. Dave O'Reilly of Chevron was worrying about the increasing competition between the East and West here talking about a bidding war for Middle East oil between, in effect, China and the West. And the Jeroen van der Veer of Shell was actually directly addressing the concept of peak oil, in which he was saying that Shell estimates that after 2015, supplies of easy-to-access oil and gas, that being a key word, will no longer keep up with demand. I would remind you that's the second biggest oil company on earth saying that the world is going to peak. So I've reiterated it, I won't reiterate it myself. It really is all about flows. The peak is coming pretty rapidly. There is very little time to adapt in what I would call a constructive way. So first of all, why does it matter? Well, one of the reasons it matters is oil is an almost ideal solution to the problem, and we now know all about it. It's a very concentrated form of energy. The only more concentrated form of energy is nuclear, which isn't easy to handle. We know about it. We know how to handle it safely. We've all had contacts with it. We understand it. Huge amount of equipment out there dependent on its use. So that means that anything that's going to be an alternative has got to be at least as good as that, at least in some of the requirements. And that's not an easy thing. It also matters because we've built our society around the use of oil. If we were talking 150 years ago, we'd have been talking about coal and a coal-based society. But we've created an oil-based society. And literally, almost everything we do, from the way we travel about, to how we get our food, to the way the society is organized, is predicated on cheap and reliable oil supplies. So, because it's only useful as flows, then what we are concerned about is anything that interrupts those flows. Now, you can have a pure geological constraint, of which the North Sea is perhaps the perfect example. People have had free access. It's a good place to invest. There's plenty of money to do it. So it really is just plain running out. You can have flows that are politically constrained. I mean, Russians flow. It may be a geological constraint. It may be a political constraint. Saudi Arabia, they get up in the morning and decide how much they're going to produce. It's a political constraint. In Nigeria, we have physical constraints. People are actually destroying infrastructure, blowing things up. We know we have skilled constraints. There's a huge shortage of engineers around the world. This is a significant constraint. And you can have capital constraints. In the case of Mexico, because of the way the Constitution is defined and Pemex's role within that, it's very difficult for outside investment to come in. In the case of Venezuela, we believe the resource is there. It has been in steady decline for about a decade. There is the possibility still that large-scale investment could reverse that. It certainly couldn't reverse it quickly. So the rest is straightforward. So we have 8 pieces of evidence suggesting that we're getting close. None of these, if you like, are overwhelming. No jury would convict on any of these alone, but collectively they provide very good circumstantial evidence. So we'll look at some of those very quickly. First of all, it's worth looking at the major oil companies. These have the wealth, skills, and until very recently, the access, and yet we find they've all peaked. They managed to, rather interesting, they managed to peak in geological progression, arithmetical projection. Start again. They all peaked. And it's a rather sobering thought that only 2 large companies, that's PetroChina and Petrobras, and 8 small companies, that's the Apaches, Anadacos, saw production gains last year. Now, one of the things the financial crisis is going to do is it's going to transfer power to those with the strong balance sheets. And some of those with strong balance sheets are going to try and buy production flows rather than develop production flows. That is fine at the individual company level. At the collective level, it's reasonably disastrous. And just how rapidly the whole thing is going pear-shaped can be seen from the fact that in the second quarter of this year, the Big Five's production fell by about 6%. A terrifyingly large number. Now, the quoted companies only account for about a quarter of world production these days. The rest is the national oil companies, and they may, of course, have different agendas. The discovery trend, you've all seen this one, but it's worth remembering. Most of the oil was discovered a long time ago. There are real restraints at which you can flow it. It's not like a larder. You don't just tip the bottles out. Typically you can't get more than about 7-8% of oil in place out even in the peak years. So although the decline on this is probably a little shallower, it's holding reasonably steady in the sort of 9 range. This is going up. It's already at 32 if you look at liquids. So we are eating into the storehouse of what we know about quite rapidly. More countries going into decline. We know about this. This is reasonably straightforward. China has done a brilliant job at squeezing a little bit more out of its oil fields. This can't actually go on forever, and we must be close to the point where they tip. We've covered those non-geologic threats, I think, a little earlier, but perhaps some of those are worth reiterating, that there's already been a huge transfer of effective power from the consumers to the producers. The producers are not unsurprisingly making use of this to take more money out of the system. The real danger is they will decide that maybe the best return on their money is not in fact to produce at all, but to leave it in the ground. So in effect, not only is the balance of power moved, I think also a potential crisis is simply the transfer of wealth. The sheer size of the wealth transfers at $147 in the summer were a key element in breaking the system. But even at $70 or $100, you have a massive wealth transfer from what is going to be a weakened consumer part of the world to the producer part of the world. And I think we can look forward to, if that's the correct term, various forms of financial crisis triggered by those sort of transfers. This, I attempted to quickly look at, who was the big importers and who are the big exporters. So we understand immediately, with this total dependence on all forms of energy imports, why Japan in 1979 outbid everyone else for the available cargoes, setting a new record for oil prices at the time. We see that the EU 25 is extremely oil import dependent. Nigeria, remember, is outside the EU. Norway, sorry, is outside the EU, which you can say it distorts that figure slightly. The US, surprisingly, is less oil dependent than Europe, and its gas dependence isn't very great, and it's still exporting coal. We start looking on the other side, if you like. Australia is doing well on both coal and gas, but is now a significant oil importer. Brazil, you wouldn't think it from all the headlines you see about Brazil, is actually an importer of all forms of energy still. In a moment it hopes not to be an oil importer, and eventually maybe not a gas importer. But for the moment it is an energy importer. Canada, significant exporter of all 3 energies, which is why when prices were high in the summer, from the end of last year, the Canadian dollar actually went temporarily to a premium to the US dollar. And finally here, we have the explanation of Mr. Putin's thin and rather unpleasant smile. Now, people have been actually working away. We talk about the dangers of peak oil, but a huge number of projects have occurred in the last 3 years. In fact, if you add those up, I think you'll find the answer is 84 projects. That's projects with a peak flow of 40,000 barrels a day or greater. And that collectively, their peak volume flow was about 8.5 million barrels a day. In other words, in the last 3 years, we've brought on 10% increment in the production. So what's happened to production? Well, what's happened to production is it's flatlined. Basically, that line is plus minus 1%. So we brought on 84 projects. We brought on 10% more capacity, and the net outcome is that. What does that tell us? What it tells us is depletion is running at a terrifying rate, because depletion has in effect offset all that gain for us. So we can't do better than that. When we examine the individual bits, I use the EIA data because I believe it to be more reliable. The EIA has a terrible habit of going whoopee, putting the number up, and a few months later revising it down. So these live a little bit behindhand. We lose the final peak, which is just a bit higher in July. Crude appeared to be in decline. They'd had this recovery when OPEC, or specifically Saudi, turns more oil on. Natural gas plant liquids, more or less constant over the period. Our great white hopes in terms of the biofuels and the tar sands and the rest of it, also going nowhere terribly fast. That, I think, is more or less self-explanatory, so I'll let you look at that. It's simply that, you know, the whole industry is now becoming old. That means that it has a huge maintenance requirement, it has a huge investment requirement, and that's not to make things better, that's to stop things getting worse. I like to put this in partly as a provocation, but partly because I believe it's correct, that reserves are simply geological curiosities unless they can be mobilized. Because for the functioning of our society, it's the flows that matter, not what the stock might be. And this I like to put in because I think it summarizes, in effect, many of the problems. This is Alaska North Slope, a very big project, came in 1 year late, nothing special about that. It more or less did its plateau exactly as predicted. It has a flat top because it was constrained by the size of the pipeline across Alaska. No point in putting in extra capacity for a very short peak. But once it comes off peak, you are confronted with rising unit costs and falling volumes. Now, if the price of oil is going north smartly, that doesn't matter, that offsets it. But of course, this is not a particularly attractive position in a business sense to find yourself in. So there is a tendency to try and minimize the expenditures. That's exactly what happened. The infield pipelines started breaking, the oil spilled over the tundra, BP had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, got itself into deep trouble with the US government, and at the end of it, still had falling production. Now, if you had one or two fields like this in your portfolio, it really wouldn't matter. But once most of the world's fields, or a high proportion of the world's fields, are in this state, you actually need continuously rising prices if you are to keep these in business. And the fact that this slide was actually issued by BP to show what a grand job they'd done in increasing the recovery and increasing the amount of reserves merely avoids the issue that, yes, you can tow the tail of the boot out, you can make an oil field last longer, but whether you can get the numbers to add up depends very much not only on the price of oil, but the rate of change of the price of oil. So how are we doing for time? Economics isn't working very well. Far too many people in our market-driven society believe that markets somehow are going to magically solve this problem. Well, there's a number of reasons why they couldn't, even if you believe passionately in them. On the demand side, everything is priced differently. You can pay anything from 20 cents a US gallon for gasoline in Venezuela or the Middle East to $9 a US gallon for gasoline here in Spain or in the UK. So that's a muddled signal. Diesel similarly has a muddled signal. Jet kerosene has no tax on at all because of a deal in the late 40s to maximize the use of airlines. We've maximized the use of airlines, but no one has the courage to put the tax on to slow that down. So, and then the existing investment, we have 900 million vehicles around the world, means that you know, any change, any adaptive response is very heavily damped. It will take a long time. On the supply side, we have producer governments the Saudis don't get up in the morning and say the price of oil has ticked up a bit, I'll open the valve, and nor do many other governments. So we have rather unpredictable responses there. We may get a response, but it's not a predictable response. And there's a whole series of bottlenecks and the very long time horizon you have. A big project typically is taking 6.5 years from when you first hear about it as a big discovery to when it flows oil. Offshore Nigeria, it's averaging 9 years, and the Kashagan project in Kazakhstan, the biggest oil field found in the last 30 years of it, is going to be at least 12 years from when it was discovered to when it first flows. Very quick look at, the hopes of enhanced oil recovery. This is Forties in the North Sea, the UK's biggest offshore field. Worked very well, came up to plateau quite quickly, went down fairly predictably. At this point was sold to Apache, who spent $1 billion to get that little uptick. That, depressingly, is the only one I can find on any one of the 260 North Sea fields I looked at. That's what the price was doing early in the summer. Prices held pretty steady in the early 2000s in a narrowish range, which is what you'd expect if supply was relatively freely coming onto the market. It then steadily headed north from early 2004. We then had a setback there, and then we had the whoopee bit earlier this year. So what was happening? Well, this is what I think was happening. That from 2004, there was little or no OPEC turn-onable spare capacity. In other words, OPEC was, in practical terms, flat out. So we were now rationing the available supply by price, and this was producing this upward trend, fairly steady, not extraordinary, but steady upward trend, about $20 a year. Then what I think we had an excursion this way, where we had overproduction by the OPEC producers. It produced a contango, stocks built up, the price dropped. OPEC then constrained production, the price started going up. Then we had a very curious anomaly that for most of this period, virtually no new capacity came on stream. Large numbers of people in the market started believing this might be really the start of peak oil, that it really wasn't coming on stream. And then, bang on cue in mid-summer, a number of fields started to come on stream. Lehman's got itself into real trouble and started unloading all sorts of contracts. Price of oil, as we know, fell. It's now obviously overshooting on the downside, and it's down here at about 70. So, I will explain as people know, I do what I call a mega projects analysis, where I add up all the projects. The gross new capacity is the blue line. The red line is with some extra time slippage. Green line takes off 10% for practical constraints, operational constraints. This is the depletion line, which I've been very conservative with. If you follow that, what you get is you get an uncertain period from 2011 to 2013, where you might just have a little bit of incremental supply, you might not. After that, it definitely starts declining away. If you're less optimistic on the depletion, that would bring that back there, and you would have a clear peak oil in 2011. This is another way of expressing the same thing. It may be easier to understand. So we've got excess supply potentially coming in these years. That's not going to occur because OPEC will turn it off. We at least potentially could push that forward, which might push peak oil a little bit into this bit. But if the depletion rate is higher than I've been allowing, then again it will bring it back. So we're pretty solidly looking in the 211, 214 range. Not beyond 214, even if everything goes terribly well, and much more likely around 211. So, are there realistic substitutes for oil products? Well, up to a point. We're going to need all these, we're going to have to work on all these, we'll have to make use of all these, but by themselves they're not going to save us. So this is how the barrel breaks down. That's a conventional barrel breakdown. That's simply reaggregating it into transport and others. Now, so essentially what we've got is we've got a transport problem. So if we start thinking of it as a transport problem, we're on the first step of finding a solution to it. Now, it's fairly difficult to do much about airline demand and ships bunker demand, so we've actually got a surface transport problem. So this can be tackled two ways. That we've first of all got to look at why we're doing all that travelling. A lot of it is commuting. Why are we commuting great distances? We want cheaper properties or larger properties, which takes us further from them. Can we do stuff in that area? Undoubtedly we can. Communication's much better. Many more people can work from home. We can probably repackage ourselves over time as to where we live and how much we move about. More importantly, surface transport is actually ideal for electrification. Electric trains work superbly well, so do trams and trolley buses. We're getting to grips with the hybrid cars and the battery-powered cars and the rest of it. So if we see this as a soluble problem, rather than throwing up our hands and seeing it as an insoluble problem, then we can start to make some progress. Because if we electrify much of our surface transport, if we rearrange how much transport we consume, we can then start making up for the shortfalls that will occur as a result of the peaking of supplies. We can keep oil in the high added value uses, which is what will keep our society functioning. So I'm optimistic. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be turbulent. Our crazy bankers haven't helped very much. But we're not going to lie down and die. We're not going to give up as a result of what's happened. So we've got to start finding these various ways we can solve this problem. So I would just add this bit from William Gibson. The future's already here, meaning that there are people who are working on the right things. There are the right solutions out there. They're not connected up. They don't have sufficient priority. But we can get there. I mean, once you split it down, it is a soluble problem. It will be pretty uncomfortable, and given long enough, it may become a less soluble problem. But for the moment, we don't have to fear anything but fear itself. Thank you very much.